Okay, everyone, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for coming out today for a Rough Cut seminar series. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Sarah Church, our speaker for today. I'm going to give a brief introduction for her. So Sarah is an assistant professor of planning in the Department of Earth Sciences here at MSU. She has professional and research experience in multiple sectors, including nonprofit, private, municipal, state government, and university contexts. Sarah completed her Master's of Planning at the University of Utah and a PhD in Planning at the University of British Columbia, both focusing on stakeholder engagement and watershed planning. During her time at Purdue, she worked on many projects, including understanding successful watershed planning processes, farmers' motivations and barriers to conservation adoption, as well as climate change communication in the agriculture sector. She plans to continue to research behavior change processes across urban and working landscapes, particularly how social learning and systems thinking influence environmental knowledge and behaviors. When not teaching, researching, or writing, Sarah hikes and cycles with her family and plays the violin in the community here at the symphony, and it's wonderful. So thank you. Let's give a round of applause.
Thank you. Thanks. So my secret identity is out. I am a violinist in the Bozeman Symphony. It's really fun. Have to find time to practice, but that's okay. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about systems thinking today, and it's really going to be kind of it's exploratory. And so I'm going to tell you a story of why I'm looking at this and kind of what we're finding and maybe next steps for moving forward with these ideas with systems thinking. So like Madison said, this research I really started at Purdue University. So I was there for about 5 years working with farmers, trying to understand their decision-making processes to implement conservation. So really what I'm really interested in is farm resilience and water quality and soil health. And so how do farmers make the decisions to implement conservation on their land to help improve the environment and help their own livelihoods, hopefully. So the context that I'm going to talk about is Indiana. Just in case you didn't know, Indiana's here, pretty far away from Montana. And I'll be talking about cover crops. So cover crops in the Midwest are different, I think, than I'm learning they are here in Montana. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about cover crops, but basically it is a crop that the farmers plant right after harvest in between cash crops. So it's basically over winter. So they plant it in enough time for the roots to you know, do their thing so that it can help capture nutrients and help with erosion and help with keeping water in the soil. And then the farmers terminate that cover crop before they plant. So it is not a cash crop, and it's simply there to cover the land during winter. And then systems thinking. So I found this awesome diagram through whole system design that really captures kind of how I'm conceptualizing systems thinking. And in the literature on wicked problems, these like climate change, water quality type problems, time and again, people talk about the need for systems, people being able to think through systems and interrelations in between and outside systems to really make these solutions happen and work on the ground. So in this context, hopefully you can actually see this okay, we're talking about the farm and homestead. So this is the system we're looking at. Oh, it doesn't, the TV thing.
Oh yeah, that screen doesn't.
Yeah. Does this work? Okay. I really am tied to the desk. And so the system has a bunch of inputs. So in this diagram, it's talking about the sun and the rain. We've got labor that goes into the system. We have seeds and fertilizer, all those kinds of inputs. Now we also have what happens after, kind of the outputs, I guess. And in this diagram, yield is in the center. And farmers really talk about yield. That is their primary concern. But there's other things listed here, like clean water or maybe not clean water. And in my context in the Midwest, there's a lot of erosion and nutrients in the water. But we can also provide habitat. We're providing food, providing to the economy and to the communities that these farms are in. And then culture. So in my mind, what this means in this system is the values that society is placing on those inputs and outputs. And so that's going to kind of dictate how the system works. So there's quite a bit of literature on systems thinking. There's a lot of people trying to teach systems thinking. And in this diagram, what we're seeing is there's kind of a continuum. And so this is just like a broad look at what I mean by systems thinking. So when you're not at all a systems thinking, you're really seeing one-way relationships. There's a cause and effect. You're not really seeing, you're seeing short-term, you're not necessarily seeing long-term or any of these feedbacks that might happen in a system. Whereas fully realized, what these authors call fully realized systems thinkers, they're really seeing relationships, not things, not individual things, but how they relate. Feedback loops, it's just not happening in isolation. And then there's multiple causes and effects. It's not simple. And so this part is, I found a bunch of cartoons that kind of try to tell you what are habits of systems thinkers. So it's actually a lot of cartoons. I'm only going to show you 8. But these are kind of the ideas, and later I'm going to show you a survey that I did with questions that are trying to get to these ideas of habits of systems thinkers. So this one is that if you're systems thinking, you're really observing things over time, and you're beginning to see patterns in relationships. And then you can also make meaningful connections within your system, say the farm system itself or outside. Maybe it's commodity prices or pollution, erosion, that sort of thing. So you're able to see a little bit further outside of your own system. Systems thinkers can think in a different way. So they're like, oh, some problem's happening. What if I thought about it in this other way? Maybe I can solve it that way. And then system thinkers are really data driven. So you don't just make a snap decision in a fully realized systems thinker kind of thing. That you're really, you're trying to get enough data that you're informed with whatever decision you're gonna make. And this goes along with not just assuming things, but systems thinkers tend to test things to see if it works. And then if it works, maybe it doesn't. Instead of going, oh, well, it doesn't work, they might change that perspective and try something else. Try to figure out what didn't work and change that. And then again, systems thinkers are really, they're long-term thinkers. So long-term, we can have a whole discussion about what that means and how long-term is. But it's not just, for example, in farming, it wouldn't be just one growing season. You're thinking years. And then another one that's important, they're all important, but this one comes time and again, that systems thinkers understand the system so much that they can find the leverage to move that system and shift it to something that might work better. And so we were interested in cover crops because we were doing a bunch of interviews and we were doing some focus groups with cover crop adopters and reading the literature, and we kept seeing the farmers talking about their farm as a system, and particularly integrating livestock into the cover crop system, because that allows the cows to eat the cover crop. And so it makes sense. The other part that makes sense is a no-till cover crop system. And so this little tool thing kind of tells you some of the stuff that I talked about with the benefits of cover crops. So these are some of the reasons why we're interested in that in the Midwest, because it really is building organic matter in the soil. It's helping the water stay in the soil, helping reduce erosion and nutrient leaching into the waterways. So here's an example of what we are seeing in the literature when farmers are talking about cover crops. I look at it as a system. You got to do the whole system. You can't nitpick. You got to manage your nitrogen. You got to get good soil seed contact because you're planting into a massive root sometimes, and you need to do everything. Just do one piece it doesn't work, they get discouraged and say that's no good and they're not going to do it anymore. You need to do everything. So this is the kind of comments that we kept hearing over and over again is everything's related and connected, and you have to give it time and figure out how to make it work for your farm system. Now, at the same time, so here's my story. So we're doing these interviews, we're doing focus groups, we're reading a bunch of literature, and we're finding this systems thinking thing going on. Well, at the same time, my boss, Linda Prokopi, had the bright idea of doing a meta review of all the US literature that talks about farmer adoption of conservation and willingness to adopt. So this was a really big project. We had quantitative literature and qualitative literature. 172 studies, 126 were quantitative, and 49 were qualitative. And I'll show you in a minute, but some systems thinking themes were emerging in the qualitative data, but there was no one was asking about systems thinking in the quantitative literature. So part of what we wondered is, like, can we develop a set of survey questions that can quantify systems thinking and the relationship to cover crop adoption, or really conservation adoption, but here I'm going to focus on cover crops mainly. So just because this was kind of an awesome project and qualitative data is very good, tells you a lot. This is the trajectory from our meta-analysis. You can see that over time there's more qualitative work going on in this area. And then these are the codes that we were seeing in terms of motivations and barriers to adoption. So it probably doesn't surprise you if you work with farmers at all that economic factors and farm management factors are important in decision making. So there are barriers and motivations in all of these codes. It just depends on how the farmer is thinking about things. Well, and other things, but systems thinking emerged in the farm management area. And just to show you here, there weren't very many studies, but some was talking about integrating livestock, and then kind of like that quote earlier, just seeing those kind of system people talking about their farm as a system. That's just to remind you. So it's got us to thinking, is there a link between systems thinking and cover crop adoption? And so we tried to find out. So we had the opportunity, the lab I was in at Purdue is pretty active, and we had a lot of surveys going out, and I was able to put in a block of questions to test these systems thinking questions out. And so using literature that really was not ag related, because there's not a lot of work at the time when I was developing these questions, I adapted some existing survey questions to try to fit with the farm and farmer context. And then because we kept hearing over and over certain things about a cover crop system, we developed some questions specific to that. And I will show you the statements soon. So we had 3 social indicator surveys. One was in the St. Mary's watershed. These are all in Indiana. One was in Big Pine Creek, and the third was in the Upper White. So I don't know if you know Indiana at all, but the Upper White is Indianapolis, the capital. Big Pine is near West Lafayette, where Purdue is. And then St. Mary's is really, it's a really big watershed, but its big city is Fort Wayne. So what I'm going to talk about here is the overall response rate and overall N, which is over 1,000 responses. So just broad general demographics here. Most respondents were male, and over half had less than 4 years of college. The median age was 63, and you can see acres there as well. The mean acres, there was one really, really large farmer in the mix. We actually double checked it because it seemed like a big difference between the mean and median. So, and 32.7% of the respondents had adopted cover crops. So just to put this in context, I just looked up the numbers because I thought I might get asked this, but I think it was 2018, and in Indiana, about 9% of the farmed acreage had cover crops. So it's not a popular practice, even though it's being marketed like crazy. So here are we going to the statements that we developed. So I'll read them out, and then we can talk about them a little bit. When I make decisions on my farm, I tend to see all kinds of possible consequences for each decision. By making plans and controlling my farm operations, I can accurately predict how successful my farm operation will be. When I have problems on my farm, I think about how I can change my operations to help reduce those problems in the future. I always look at the interconnections and mutual influences between all of the decisions that go into my farm management. I think there's one more. I think continuously about how to improve my farm operations. So you can see that there's there's agreement mostly with these statements. So we have a 1 to 5 scale where 5 is the most agree, and they're all falling around 4. So there's some agreement with that. You'll also notice that we don't have a lot of statements about on the lower systems thinking scale to kind of test whether these higher ones would match with lower ones. So it's like the first 2 are kind of more like, oh, it's out of my control. We could have done some sort of question or statement about, you know, it's the weather, or, you know, whatever, some sort of non-control or some of those other lower level systems thinking questions. These factored well into a group. And then we also did these cover crop statements, and these factored into 2 groups. So one was what we called synergistic effect. So this is about the farm operation itself. So if cover crops work well with no-till, and do cover crops work well with livestock? And then kind of the external effects, we wanted to know, because we've been hearing this with some people that cover crops, they didn't need to use pesticides as much, and that they reduced weeds. You hear other things too that are opposite of that. But you can see there's not nearly the agreement, especially with pesticides, with these connections with the cover crop system. So when we compared cover crop adopters to non-adopters, we found that there was a significant difference with the people who were answering the highly on the systems thinking versus the non-adopters. And this was true with these cover crop statements as well. So that makes, like, cover crop adopters must be systems thinkers, right? So that's one of our conclusions that we're wondering about. And what does that mean? We did do a lot of analyses because we had a lot of data, and we found that these are the practices we asked about: conservation tillage, cover crops, conservation plan, and nutrient management plan, and they all had the same relationships with the systems thinking and adoption of those practices. We also looked at intensity and found, so this means how many practices each farmer had adopted. And you can see this percentage keeps going down, but the more practices the farmer had adopted, the more likely they were to be scoring high on the systems thinking scale too. So we're seeing quite a bit of evidence, with at least with those particular statements, that there might be a relationship here. So for us, we work really closely with NRCS and soil and water staff. And in Indiana, we learned that there was really a concerted effort to talk about the farm as a system and talk about a suite of practices that work together. And so it made us wonder if we are only reaching that small percent of farmers, and that, like, non-adopters are just checking out. They don't hear that message, or don't want to hear it, because they don't necessarily think that way, particularly with the long-term approach to conservation. So, kind of existential question: should we shift away from a systems approach to messaging? Do we need to teach systems thinking? Maybe there's both. So this led us to wanting to do more research. And so I'm going to tell you about a project that we're still analyzing and trying to figure out what it means. But we got some funding from the National Wildlife Federation basically, we got to ask conservation staff how they were messaging conservation, and then we got to talk to their farmers to see how they were receiving those messages. And the farmers that we interviewed, we wanted to interview what we're calling mid to late adopters. So these aren't people who are all in on conservation. They're either just started, maybe haven't adopted, or less than 5 years usually is what we tried for. It's hard to get those folks to talk to you. The conservation farmers like talking about what they're doing. So those are some of the questions that we wanted to know. Like, can we gauge how farmers, if they're systems thinkers? And then this messaging question, and really trying to understand if there's a disconnect between the two, and then what do we do after that? So we had 12 interviews of agency staff and 11 of farmers in 3 different watersheds. One, Big Pine Creek, they have a lot of money. They have a lot of watershed funding, and doing a lot of work on conservation. So that's it's a little unique. And the other 2 watersheds don't have as much conservation going on there. So we didn't have a ton of funding. So this was our pilot approach to talk to people. So overall, and it probably won't surprise you if you work with soil and water farmers, conservation staff are really customer focused. They want to help their farmers. And so when we're asking them, how do you talk about conservation? It was really problem driven. So, like, either the staff person is seeing a problem and going to that farmer, or the farmer is coming to them and say, I have a problem. What can you help me? But the staff are always trying to please their customer. And then cost share, the Farm Bill cost share programs were really key. So if they had money to implement cover crops, which is happening a lot, they would really try to push that. But this idea with the being customer focused is that the staff really understand that they need to bring the farmers on slowly. And so they talked a lot about a practice continuum. So I'll read this quote. If I'm working with somebody that's never really done very much conservation before, if I can get them to do one practice, I figure that's an improvement. But then it depends on if they were already doing some things, then we might talk more about doing multiple practices for the synergistic effect. So these conservation staff really talked a lot about how all the practices work together. And they're really told from state level NRCS to do that. And here's a quote about practice interactions. So they usually talk about individual practices. And again, that's related to the problem, right? So they're trying to solve a problem, and sometimes that can be one practice. But they're all tied together in a system. So for example, you cannot do cover crops without not considering other parts of the puzzle, other parts of the farming system, or tillage, because conservation tillage begins at harvest time. So as you harvest, you have to consider the other components to it. Rarely do things act in a vacuum. They're always interrelated somehow, shape, or form, especially with agronomic practices. I mean, that's probably not a surprise to all of you, but it does beg the question, like, how much of that conversation should the staff be having with the farmer? I don't think we actually know that yet. We've found that the agency staff think longer term than farmers, and that can definitely be a barrier to adopting conservation, especially cover crops. Talking about long-term benefits, that could be a hindrance, especially when you're talking to some of our older farmers. They may say, well, we'll leave that for the next guy. Of course, if they don't see a benefit right away, they may not want to be in that system. And some of these take multiple years to see the benefits. But the farmers that we interviewed, I mean, everybody thinks of their farm as a system. It's just how much do they think of it as a system, and how far out does that system go, and which other systems can it connect to? And we saw a lot of differences with that. So next steps, real next steps, this was next steps that we're kind of doing. We need to refine the statements. We think farmers are inherently systems thinkers. I mean, farming is really complicated. But our statements aren't getting to really how complicated the system is, and those complications of thinking and connecting within and outside systems. And we're also thinking about developing a continuum. So that first slide between the not at all to fully realized, is there a way that we can, even with our statements that we have, kind of see if there's a continuum? So it's not, oh, they're a systems thinker or not. There's actually a range, which we totally saw in the interviews. So there's different ways of doing that. There's a mental models approach where you're really just like getting the farmer's perspective on their farm and all the components that go into it. And then this article, Mann et al. 2019, they were looking at grazing managers, but they had really cool statements they developed about systems thinking that I think we could probably use, because they're way more nuanced. And I was gonna do some examples, but I didn't, because there's like 40 of them, and how would you choose? But you can definitely look up that paper. I know the authors had trouble getting it through just because it's a hard concept, systems thinking, and it was Q-sort methodology, so there was, anyway, but it's really good and interesting way to think about how next steps for refining these statements. That being said, I do wonder if surveys are just not the right tool to get to systems thinking, because it's so complicated, and talking to people, you get the hows and whys. but people like quantifying things and significance. And so I think it's worth trying to figure out how to make these work better. This is an example of what I was trying to get our staff to do at Purdue. They were hesitant, but to sit down with the farmer and ask them to draw their, like, what do you do at harvest? You know, any given, or planting, any given planting season, what decisions and what are you thinking about? This person was really on board with that. He just took the paper and started writing things, but you can see a lot of these habits that we talked about at the beginning. Data, really thinking it through with the pros and cons, and then actually writing, like being able to change and adapt. Good data, good decisions, position of strength. So this is one way that we could try to capture the thinking, and then maybe move those towards more robust set of survey questions to really tackle this. And that's what I have. I have no idea how I'm on time. But yeah, thank you. Oh yeah, it's pretty quick. Yes.
I had a couple questions. First, I wondered if you saw any correlation between educational level and degree of systems thinking.
Yeah.
And then just in general, do you have a sense of whether farmers have more or less systems thinkers compared to the general population?
Oh, that's a big question. All right, so the question is education level related to systems thinking. I'm sure we looked at that. I don't think that these demographic data actually showed as much as the adoption, but I would have to look at the data again. What we did see, which is probably not surprising, is education level did correlate to adoption just itself. And that meta-analysis also shows that. I don't know the answer to the second question related to the general public. That's a good question. Yes.
And just as a quick note, there
Oh,
are
thank you.
microphones on the benches, so turn that on. People online can hear.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. This is really super neat. I was struck by, or I'm interested in this concept, systems thinking, and just hearing a little bit more about your thoughts, maybe your reflections from your reading in the literature. It seems to me like there's a few different ways I heard it talked about in the talk, and I'm just wondering if these are right. That there's a way of there's a set of practices that we can associate with systems thinking, like a way of thinking relationally, or being open to experimentation, or sort of constantly assessing and moving and shifting. And then there's also sort of recognizing things as a system. So I see this as a system. And so to me, I see there's sort of there's both an ontology of systems thinking, like my worldview is that the world is a system and I exist in it, but then maybe also that I can identify systems. And so it's more like an epistemology sort of situation, like I can see those practices. And I'm just wondering what does the literature say about where systems thinking comes from, or how people relate to it as a, sort of worldview versus identity they take on or thing they learn?
Yeah, well, so being able to recognize systems is one of those habits. And the literature, if I'm going to remember right, it's related to worldview, but it's not necessarily a worldview. It is just a way of thinking. And so again, being able to identify systems is not necessarily a worldview, but part of your skill set. And so there's a lot of literature on teaching systems thinking. And so there's steps to that process. And so then you're like fulfilled as a systems thinker once you go through all this stuff. But that's really, that's deeper than my brain has thought about it in terms of worldview, but that's a good question that it's probably out there. Yes.
You posed two questions. One was, do we shift away from systems approach? And then the other one was, do we teach systems thinking?
Mhm.
So based on what you've learned, do you have answers, suggestions to that? I mean, where should extension go? Should we go away from trying to teach systems approach, or should we try to teach systems?
I don't think we should move away. I think we should be careful because we don't want to alienate, I guess, is like we don't want to just, I think there's a continuum like the practitioners were talking about. You have to know your customer and you don't want to say something that's just going to alienate them right off the bat. So I do think, yes, we should be teaching systems thinking. I don't know what that looks like, but I guess, it is kind of a worldview in that, like, if we could just shift everyone to systems thinkers, then maybe all our problems would be solved. But yeah, I think it's actually a combination, especially with these non-conservation farmers, because they really are, in my experience, the rare few that I get to talk with, they're worried about they're paying the bills and livelihoods and family. And that's hard you can't necessarily move past that if you just need to pay your mortgage that month or that season. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So it seems like with a one-on-one, you're going to focus maybe more on the individual problems, but then collectively, because when we do both, we talk to the whole audience people. And that might be the place to go systems, whereas when it's one-on-one, it's more.
Yeah, maybe, although, like, are you going to get the non-systems thinkers to the table? If you're, I think there's a marketing thing. So maybe you're trying to solve a problem in your field day or workshop, and then you sneak it in. Because what I also heard in these interviews is like, so soil health's a new big thing, and they're actually moving away, these practitioners I talked to, having soil health days and whatnot, because they're just getting the same people every time. And so the people that aren't on board are like, oh yeah, another system or another soil health thing, I'm not going to go. But maybe if they had like a gully over erosion workshop, like, yeah, I have gullies, I need to figure out how to fix that. And then you can sneak in the synergistic approach.
Yeah, that's helpful.
You're welcome. Yes.
So in your survey, did the percentage of farmers who adopt cover crops change between organic and conventional farmers, or
We did not look at organic.
there's
So
no organic farmers? That's
not in our sample. And there's not really a lot in Indiana anyway. It's very intense conventional corn and soy. There are a few, and they're within like their little pockets, having to work within. It's actually pretty interesting to talk with those guys.
It seems that organic would be by nature more systems.
they have to use cover crops. That's why I was asking.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in terms of that meta-analysis, we did have organic in there, but there's not there in the time frame and the criteria we used. There wasn't a whole lot of literature on barriers and motivations around conservation adoption and organics. So maybe that's a gap, people, that we can look at. Yes.
I'm just wondering if you thought about land ownership trends and if you have any questions in the survey, because you mentioned a lot of the farmers are older, on maybe how they're seeing their farm passed down, if they're planning to pass it down to relatives, or if that affected their thinking. Maybe some interviews too. I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. We've asked a lot of those questions about land tenure, both like if they have to rent or own, and if they're planning on passing the farm down. Yeah, all of those have a lot of implications for adoption. So as you might guess, if you're renting land, if you don't have a supportive landlord, you're less likely to put the time and effort and money into conservation. Yeah, and if the farmer is trying to pass their land down to the next generation, they typically talk about the land in more of a stewardship approach and are more likely to adopt conservation. But we do keep hearing that they don't have people to pass the land down to because their children aren't interested. So yeah, go ahead. Oh, don't forget if you can, I'll try to repeat the question too, the microphone.
It's good to have the mic on, because then I was just about to say I don't know much about polling, so I'm just going to ask the ignorant question. I do know a lot about push polls because I get them on the phone all the time from the politicians.
Yeah.
So is there opportunities to use push polls like that to say, and Bruce, you can help, if you have a cover crop, it may cost you, may lose profit this year, but a 5-year moving average, you tend to do better. I don't know if that's true or not. I think that's true. But but if the data supports that, if you could ask those kind of questions, like, would you instill conservation efforts given the fact that over a 10-year trend you end up making more money?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
we have asked those questions. Probably not in a survey approach. And the answer is maybe, but probably not. It depends on what they're valuing. So if it's 5 years is a long time on the economic side.
Yeah.
So soil health is another thing, or organic matter. That's a whole different question. So it depends on what they're putting up as the highest value for their decision making, if that would be a good argument. And in terms of like phone surveys, those are really hard to get good response rates on. So I would not recommend it. Julia?
So I'm kind of hung up on the instrument issue and the language issue. And I'm just curious if you can talk, I'm sure that it's like something you think about all the time. It's like, are these questions that people can meaningfully engage with on a paper survey? And I just say that like sometimes we have a chance to present some of our survey instruments like in public dialogues to warn people about what's coming. And you get a lot of like chatter just about the questions. And so I'm just wondering about, where you think the opportunities are in terms of like, is there some super groovy way to pilot this with someone to really learn about, and I'm going to say something that is not really fair, but like I do see sets of categories in how good farmers are at verbal communication. And I just wonder if there's like a place where someone can be a systems thinker, but not especially like, ready to answer those questions. Are they just saying, I mean, because a lot of the answers are probably threes, right? Like, just basically like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe. So I just
No,
encourage you to talk
and
more
that's
about that. I think
why
it's super interesting.
like really coming back to like maybe surveys aren't the right way to get to this, and like something like a mental model where you can really spend time and understand the thought process, because those are hard questions. I do think those Q-sort questions with the grazing management, there's enough of them. I mean, it's like 40 statements that there's ways of designing it that you can test that they're actually answering them similarly.
Mhm.
And then those range a lot more than like, I think I had 6.
Yeah.
Like, so yes, I totally hear you. And I think surveys are hard to get complex ideas from. That's all. That's all I have. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. It's a super interesting talk and framework for thinking about these problems. Also on the topic of instruments and approaches, I wonder about any past experience you've had or in trying to leverage existing records or correspondence, if like certified crop advisors would potentially, I don't know how much of that communication happens via email, probably not a lot, but maybe some, and or like co-op records, if they have like past history of people inquiring, and if you could potentially dig into those resources with contact information redacted, because I'm sure they wouldn't give you that, but and maybe get in and code and see like how often do people ask questions beyond like how much nitrogen do I put down, but like how do I need to think about last year's crop when I think about nitrogen or whatever, like just interesting little codes and maybe larger existing data sets. Is that something that you've looked at in the past? Or
No, that's a really interesting idea. That privacy would, the data privacy would be, we'd really have to think through that. But no, that's a super interesting idea. What we have done is looked at ag trade publications and what they're saying, but that doesn't get to the farmer decision-making part. We've also observed interactions between crop advisors and farmers. But at that time, we definitely weren't thinking about systems thinking. So it's really interesting if you just have a conversation with someone, how much, if you're actually looking for systems thinking, you can find it everywhere. But yeah, thank you for that idea. I'll mull on that.
I mean, I also think about like hearing farmers talk about their journals. And
Yeah.
like, and if you could, I mean, they're not going to hand you their journal, but some might. But then you might be like, can you look through your journal and send me a photograph of like the 2 most whatever type things you have in there?
Yeah.
I don't know. Just thinking about like ways to efficiently exploit existing past information.
That's awesome. Thank you. I see a hand up.
Is it not feasible to do, say, short answer questions that would give them more opportunity to elaborate?
Yes, definitely. You can do that. It's really hard to analyze, and it takes a lot of time. And depending on how many surveys, we have done that before. Not with the systems thinking, but it's a big effort, and you have to really think through. Because I mean, honestly, a survey that's not why you do a survey, is to have those types of questions. But yeah, you could. And it's worth thinking about. Because you could, if you have it in a survey and you have enough people responding, you could begin to quantify that and try to do the correlations. Other questions? Comments?
One of the questions that you stated earlier was, is there a link between system thinking and cover crop production? Did you ever notice, like on a pounds per acre scale, if system thinkers had a greater production than non-system thinkers?
We didn't look at that. Yeah, well, we don't ask yield either. I don't think they would tell us, to be honest. But that's a good question too. I don't know the answer to that.
I think having that evidence might persuade, to say if system thinkers do have a greater production on a pounds per acre scale, and you have that evidence, then it might help you guys in the long run convert people that aren't system thinkers.
Yeah.
to system thinkers.
Yeah, well, but there is data on cover crops and yield, which again gets to this long-term thing, because there's probably 3 years is what we're hearing before they can even get their system to work properly. And so we do hear the yield is reduced until you get that system and you get the organic matter to increase. But yeah, thank you for that. It's great ideas. That's what I was hoping for, is some great ideas. Any other comments, questions? Okay.